any safety professional out there that has wanted to change the narrative from compliance to care, if you like, or to the thing beyond, I think really needs to change themselves first. To give you an example of a punchy conversation, a couple of months in, I was getting quite bored of doing the executive leadership sort of report, which clearly nobody read, right?
Yep.
And I literally I think a couple of the meetings in, I said, well, do you know what? I'm going to take this report as read, because I hope you've all read this report, right? And I remember at a meeting, she blew up one of the directors and basically said something like, if you cared more about your people than actually the amount of reports that you've got to read and everything else, you might do a better job. Yeah. I've always found that really hard as a person because I'm sort of quite emotional, right? So, you know, I always get I always suffer during a difficult conversation because I do feel all the emotions, but it wasn't until sort of I met certain people in my career that taught me how to harness that and sort of how to sort of, you know, feel the emotion and let it go.
With the various organisations you've worked for, private sector, you know, public sector, what's your reflections on how well understood from the non-safety professionals, so the executives that you've engaged with in those roles, how well do you think they understand that concept around legal compliance and that is the minimum standard, not what good looks like necessarily? And how do you broker that with them? I
think there's definitely the ability to influence is one thing, right? But I think the key one that supports that, and you can't really influence until you've got this, is trust. Safety is not about getting everything 100% right. Safety is about how we fail safely. What do we learn when we fail?
Just to get us started, do you want to sort of tell the folks out there a little bit about yourself, your background, what got you into or inspired you to get into health and safety as a career, and where has it taken you so far?
Interesting. Right, I'm going to have to delve back into the old vaults. So I was one of those people that fell into health and safety. It never was my career choice. I started off wanting to go into environmental health, and it was through the environmental health route that I was exposed to health and safety. And I instantly connected with the topic. To the point that when I went on my placement year, because you do like a placement year in industry, I decided to just stay all my time in health and safety rather than going to the food safety or the housing elements or anything else. So I just very much kept with that. So I kind of then made a beeline for that career, but I finished off my degree in environmental health. I got a job in the health and safety enforcement team at Westminster Council, so back in the day, and I was an HC sort of inspector for Westminster Council, so essentially doing incident investigations and sort of approvals for asbestos works and things like that. So that's kind of how I got into it. And it was then through the military that I then deployed to Iraq, to Basra, with the rifles. And coming back from that, I had a bit of an awakening. So I actually wanted to do something that was a bit more challenging. So I decided to go into leadership roles as a result of that. And I had my first sort of opportunity at one of the London boroughs, Hammersmith and Fulham. And I was given the opportunity to head up sort of corporate health and safety sort of there. And then that's kind of how it grew. And I've just stayed and developed sort of in that health and safety field. So here I am. That's kind of where I've ended up, really.
And what was the inspiration to you around wanting to move into more that the leadership space? What was it that kind of sort of niggled at you to want to have the curiosity to move into that?
So I think, quite honestly, sort of the motivator for me, I think, understanding me as a person, I've always been quite timid and quite shy, sort of growing up, and everything else. I never really sort of thought of myself as a leader, and it was my experiences sort of in the military that sort of brought me and coked me out of my shell. And if I'm honest, I just kept seeing people make some really terrible decisions in and around me. I thought, I can do better, or I think I could do better, and that was really my sort of instigator. And then obviously, as I did more and more of that, I could see that I could do it. I had a very good knack for connecting with people, and I also had I've got a very sort of high very high sort of self level of ethical behaviour. So I don't tend to drop my standards for corporate goals or whatever. So I think people like that sometimes, you know, because you sit there and you fight for people as opposed to fight for the mission of the task. And I think that's quite an important thing. So for me, it was something that sort of naturally sort of got me into that. And the more and more I did it, I could see that I was able to do it.
I can imagine from in a military application, not a leader not taking the time to stop and assess a risk and make sure it's safe before proceeding is obviously has pretty catastrophic consequences, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think the connection to safety in the military was really interesting, and I think just in the way that it sort of formed my thinking around safety. So, as a soldier, and I started off as a soldier before I commissioned, but as a soldier, you get taught the right way of doing things, all the processes and procedures, and the right way of doing things, and then you get into the field, and like you've got some sergeant who's basically done this for like years and countless of times, like you don't need that, don't need that, don't need that, don't need that. And you're like, oh, so why do they teach us to carry all this stuff? But in practice, you don't actually need any of this stuff, or you need something else, or you need it tweaked. And I'm thinking, that was my initial thinking around sort of work as imagined versus work as done.
Yes.
And actually I'm thinking, well, from a safety perspective, we do exactly the same, right? We tell people to do X, Y, and Z, but actually when they go out the front, say, oh, we don't need to do that, or we don't need to follow that procedure, or that's... So that's what sort of got me curious. And then when I started to really have the capability to understand that and put it into safety words or put it into vocabulary, that's when it started to make sense, in my head anyway. And it was only until I moved to New Zealand and I met, there's two occasions actually. The first one was John Green, who used to work for Lang & Rourke.
Yep.
And he did a really interesting sort of experiment really, where he basically compared two sites, and one was performing really well in audits, one wasn't, but the one that wasn't performing well in audits was actually the safer site. And I've often thought a lot of that, and it ended up they were just like ticking boxes versus just managing really well. And that was like the first one. And then when I went to New Zealand, I had a fantastic meeting with Daniel Hammerdell, who was taken over there by WorkSafe. Just connected with Daniel really well. And then sort of just started reading more and more and more. And I suddenly thought, wow, all the stuff that's been in my head and that I thought, people are actually making a safety sort of theory over it, or there's a theme to it. So that's kind of what got me sort of exploring and got me really, really curious about this thing. So all of a sudden I went from being a safety practitioner, and back in the day, obviously as an enforcer, I probably was very compliance driven. But then you realize, oh, there's another way. And actually now there's actually a new way of looking at this. I don't like calling it the new way because I think there's a lot of polarization around that, but there is another way of looking at this. And I think for me, it certainly made a lot more sense. It was far more natural to the way that I sort of thought leadership could be done.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was talking to a chap the other day who had been a VP of a very large multinational company, and his reflection, and these were airside operators in airports around the world, and his reflection was that the markets where they had the most regulation, they had the highest harm rates, which is a very similar scenario to,
I think
to
it's
that
amazing.
Lang & Rourke
Yeah, that's not a coincidence, right? I think people get caught up or more worried about going through those processes and those cycles, which actually takes them away from the concentration or whatever you actually need to do, what you need to do. And I think there's probably a lot of energy spent in doing the other. So yeah, I do think there's a correlation between that somehow.
Yeah. And then the other reflection on that is that the kind of current paradigm for safety that we've seen for since post World War II, which is this kind of the regulator regulates and writes the rules, the business tries to meet those rules, the safety professionals get developed to support the business to meet those rules, the technology companies build technology to help the safety professionals help the companies to meet those rules. Yet we seem to have globally plateaued in terms of our ability to further reduce harm. And so there seems to be something above what we're doing at the moment that seems to be able to unlock a lot more harm reduction. And I think it's some of these culture type approaches where we're thinking about a much more holistic view of the attributes in an organization, such as leadership and human behaviors and some of these perhaps non-traditional attributes from a safety management perspective that are actually starting to move the dial, which we're going to explore a little bit more about through the session.
I completely agree. I think when you get to that compliance point, it literally is about meeting that compliance point. You don't really take in the other sort of areas, as we've mentioned, the how people feel, how people need to do work, or I just think that isn't part of the conversation. Therefore, you will naturally get to a point where you can't go any further. I think that is the limitation. And I think if, let's be quite frank about it, the way that legislation is set out, it's the absolute minimum point. So you almost say that there's an absolute minimum that we want you to get to, and then you're okay. Is that enough? Well, for some businesses, it may well be enough. But I truly believe that when you're dealing with with harm and people being injured or potentially killed, I think you need to treat people as human beings, and every life matters, and therefore you need to go a bit further than that. And I think that's the junction that maybe a lot of businesses sort of find themselves sort of wrestling with sometimes. I don't know.
So with the various organisations you've worked for, private sector, public sector, what's your reflections on how well understood from the non-safety professionals, so the executives that you've engaged with in those roles, how well do you think they understand that concept around legal compliance, and that is the minimum standard, not what good looks like necessarily? And how do you broker that with them?
That's a really interesting question. I think I will say, being quite honest, I'm always blown away at just how little executives know when it comes to safety.
Yep.
And that's fine because they're not safety experts, right? But just the stuff that you'd expect them to know. So I think they're all aware of safety. They're all aware of the compliance elements. They're all aware of legislation. I think everybody's much more aware that you can go to prison now, corporate manslaughter, all that sort of stuff, which is, which takes some to get there, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think they're all aware of that. What blows me away is that they can't sort of link the dots between sort of enhanced performance and productivity and safety. I think that's the bit that blows me away the most. And when I'm speaking to execs, it just sometimes is quite jarring to think that they're in a position of massive influence and they don't understand that basic paradox. That for me, I still think, wow, how are you in a leadership role? How have you not been curious about going down that particular road to find out more? I find that really, really amazing.
Yeah, it's a real challenge for safety professionals, particularly safety leaders. Most of the executives I've interacted with, and it's probably the same for you, they don't turn up to work wanting to harm people that work in their organisation. 100%. They've got good intent. But there's a gap there between what they know and what they need to know in order to exercise their role as a leader in their business. Yeah. And I guess, it's incumbent on the safety professionals as a leadership piece for how that can be brokered to be able to take those people on that journey, I guess.
And I think that's a hard thing to do, because I think a lot of it depends on the actual safety professional themselves and some of the skill sets that we are, quite frankly, not prepared for as a profession, right? So we are fantastic when it comes to the technical skill sets and writing a risk assessment and assuring, safety system work and all that sort of good stuff. I think as a profession, we lack some of those softer skills around sort of being able to influence, being able to push back and challenge, being able to talk the same language as business, so that you can actually be seen as an equal, not as the compliance guy. And I do think that, going back to the question around the leader's view of safety, I do think that for them, a lot of it is, am I compliant? Have we ticked those boxes? Great, I'm not going to jail, we're done. It's like, well, you're done on one level of it, but actually you can do so much more if you did a bit extra or whatever. And I think the skill is being able to connect with them, to show them that there's something different. I think that's the skill set that I think is necessary. So I think any safety professional out there that is wanting to change the narrative from compliance to care, if you like, or to the thing beyond, I think really needs to change themselves first.
Yes. Yep.
So you've got to go through that transformation process yourself. If you don't change, then nothing else around you is going to change. So I think that's the best bit of advice I give to any safety professional, is actually lean into it and actually be the change that you want to see, and you will need to change. I think a lot of it as well depends on how you've gone into the profession. I think there's a lot of health and safety professionals who just tend to rise through the ranks and find themselves as accidental leaders. Yep. And then all of a sudden, all they know is the compliance world or the auditing world, or and they go from managing their own audits to maybe managing multiple audits or whatever. But
which just perpetuates the same
100%. You're just perpetuating that entire story again and again and again. So if you want to change that narrative, then you have to be the one that's prepared to be a bit courageous, put your head above the parapet. There are situations where you need to have a difficult conversation. If you don't know how to have that, it's quite hard. Yeah. I've always found that really hard as a person because I'm sort of quite emotional, right? So I always get I always suffer during a difficult conversation because I do feel all the emotions. Yep. But it wasn't until sort of I met certain people in my career that taught me how to harness that and sort of how to sort of feel the emotion and let it go. But unless you have that curiosity or or that ability to do that, I think it's very difficult to naturally go in and do it. But ultimately, it is about sort of displaying all those sort of non-technical sort of skill sets to be able to connect.
You could use Auckland possibly there in terms of a full-blown sort of culture-led approach, engaging with Stephen and Phil and educating the management team, giving all the GMs that direct visibility.
I do wonder whether that was not more luck than by design. Because I think a lot of it was based, and I suppose you could narrate it back, it's confidence, right? So I came in from the UK, to basically lead Auckland through this new sort of risk management phase and everything else. And a lot of it, they were all ears. So that was part of it. I was massively buoyed and confident in my own knowledge, so I could speak to them as equals, which is something I probably wouldn't have done in my old roles.
So that's an interesting
which is an interesting one, right? Because it's a confidence thing. Whether it was artificially created or whether it was there, that it was there. And that allowed us to connect on that real level. The other thing was also the situation that the organisation found themselves in, right? So they just recently had a fatality, a 19-year-old waste collector who, had massively rocked the organisation. And from that point of view, they really wanted to do something. So they were all receptive as well. And I think that's the thing. It's like you can be the best talker or influencer, but if people aren't ready to listen, then so I think that was the beauty of Auckland. It was like you had me who by design or by position was in a fantastic place to communicate how I really felt about it, and then you had an executive who was receptive. That was just magic. So it
all
did
the bits
work.
just aligned.
100%, and it all aligned. And again, I don't think that's all luck. I think there are some skill sets within that, but a lot of it was very much the situation. And I think ultimately for me, when I decided very much to take sort of Auckland Council on that sort of proactive safety journey, I knew that there was still a few leaders within that group that weren't necessarily sold on it. So that's kind of where we had to really focus and do the effort. And I remember one example was really interesting. I had a really passionate health and safety inspector in my team. Sorry, inspector, really bad term. Health and safety professional in my team. And I remember at a meeting, she blew up one of the directors and basically said something like, if you cared more about your people than actually the amount of reports that you've got to read and everything else, you might do a better job. And it was funny because I had to rein her in, but the reality is that she was speaking
from the heart.
From the heart, right? And because of the type of leader that individual was, a chap called Barry Potter, like I knew he was into it. He was pretty much one of the sponsors for bringing me over from the UK. So I knew he was in, but that really connected with him. And that really started opening up the doors. Well, how do we show people then that we care? Because as an executive, I do have to do a lot of reading. I do have to do a lot of work. I do have to go to meetings. And it's like, okay, well, let's talk about how you can take ownership of your leadership style to start carving out time to do the things that really matter. Like, when was the last time you walked around a site just to walk around a site and understand, as opposed to I'm going there for a meeting and doing something deliberate? So when was the last time you gave yourself permission to do that? And that gave way to the whole sort of, understanding what we manage sort of program and starting going to have a look at places and doing these little tiki tours of places. And that was fantastic. Visible
leadership.
100%, right? So from a visible leadership point of view, it worked really well, but an education point of view, they understood things that they had. The genuine conversations they were having with people were just fantastic. So I think all that sort of stuff really, really helped solidify that. So yeah, that was there. The other thing that always sticks in my mind around the Auckland Council sort of journey was just around the richness of the culture with the Maori influence there. So I lent heavily into into the Manakatanga principles, and I thought that was just incredible. Like, so you had a fantastic cultural sort of framework of which you can hang safety on, and that aligned really naturally to what Auckland was doing, particularly within the biculturalism space. So it was just a lovely fit, and it was just something that was really, 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 really cool to do. So yes, I think ultimately bringing it all back together, it's around having sort of the right corporate direction and sort of desire to move in that particular way, the confidence and the conviction to be able to have those sort of punchy conversations. I'll give you an example of a punchy conversation. In a couple of months in, I was getting quite bored of doing the executive leadership sort of report, which clearly nobody read, right?
Yep.
And I literally I think a couple of the meetings in, I said, well, do you know what? I'm going to take this report as read because I hope you've all read this report, right? I'm happy to take any questions. No questions. So right, let me tell you about a couple of things that happened to me this month, which I think were really interesting from a safety perspective. And they were more engaged in that sort of stuff than they were in the report. And the report was just typical, all your other stuff that you tend to manage, so the LTI rate and all that sort of stuff that we have to manage. Right? I'm not saying it's not important, it is, but you that tells it stops connection. Boards don't connect with that sort of stuff, but they loved the stories that we were saying. A couple of incidents, and we'd play back the incident and we'd play back the learning, and they found that fascinating because it was like that true sort of.
It's giving it a face, right?
Yeah,
it's taking a number and a report and it's giving it a face.
And it was that accidental discovery that sort of led me to take it one step further. I said, right, I'm going to start changing these up a little bit now. I'm actually going to do the report, but I'm not going to talk about it. They've got the report. I'm going to go in there, and every month I'm going to do a video walk around of somewhere different. So we went down the Waitakere Ranges. We went down to the waste transfer station, all filmed with a GoPro and showing up. And honestly, you had the HR director sort of looking, oh, wow, that looks really dangerous. Like how, and it just prompted loads of questions that you could then answer. And that was far more engaging. So there was a real buzz. So I think knowing how to sort of lean into their curiosity, it helps a lot. And I think ultimately it's then understanding which directors you're then going to play off to get the message. So again, the finance director was always quite an interesting one, right? It's around adding value. So what value do we demonstrate? And I think for us at Auckland, we did a particular sort of exercise where we started to track and measure the cultural improvements in safety. And you can't really do that without having the basics like the systems and everything else. So it was this whole tracking process. But we demonstrated that with a 12% increase sort of in our culture that we measured, that we returned a 40% reduction or 42% reduction in harm. In New Zealand, because of the way that their ACC is set up, that's monitorable, that's monetary.
For listeners out there, ACC is like workers' compensation insurance.
Correct, So there's actually a monetary value to that, which is really clear. Perhaps not as clear as it is in the UK, but it's really clear there. I think it translated into $7 million. And even that sort of blew me away when you think, whoa, so over 24 months, we've improved the management systems of the organization, this cultural journey, people are buying in, the narratives are there, the engagement is there, and then this translates into X. That's quite mind-blowing. So again, for somebody to actually see that, the director, again, it's just you're slowly sort of
appealing to their needs.
100%. So you're slowly getting all of them on board. And I think that certainly helps with the narrative.
So it's an important consideration around who are my stakeholders, what are their needs, how do they look at the world, and what I need to do to influence them in the way that works for them so that they can see the world the way I need them to be able to see it, right?
Yeah, 100%. Not everyone will see the world from I just want people to go home safe.
Correct, yeah.
That's the reality, right? So you've got to find a way that sort of appeals to them.
That's a great takeout for people out there listening to that is, are these people socially driven? Are they economically driven? Is it about finance? Is it about cost reduction? Is it about leadership and being on a bit of a pedestal and feeling good about that, wanting to be the best? A lot of organisations put their hand up about being the best at safety and things like that. So I think that's a good takeout for the safety professionals out there listening around who are my internal stakeholders? Do I understand what their needs are? How do they look at the world? And how do I need to bring to the table the likes of the initiatives that you've just explained to try and give a face to safety, take it out of the traditional sort of reports on the board and the board pack or the executive team pack. Give it a face, tell the stories, give it, make it tangible and real for them, so that you're actually taking action to break down the traditional way of doing it. Otherwise, nothing will change, right?
100%. Their narrative will never change. Their framing on the world will never change, and the reality is they just cycle through. And then you can understand why almost there's this boredom or this mundaneness associated with safety sometimes, because nothing changes. What's exciting? What's new? This is where I'm really excited about the current future of where we are with technology and AI. I think that will, if harnessed right by the safety professional, I think we can really do some amazing stuff with that. So again, it's incumbent on us really as safety professionals to to understand what's out there from the safety world and from the tech world, to be able to how do I problem solve this sort of stuff, and how do I get it together. So yeah, I think it's incumbent on the safety professional to be constantly on the lookout for changing attitudes onto what they do, or bring in new techniques just to keep it fresh. Otherwise the frame is always same, right? All they get to see is this LTI graph either plateauing or going up or going down, and so what.
Yeah. You mentioned an interesting comment earlier in the session, along the lines of, as safety professionals, we don't get developed in a way that supports the stuff that sits above that kind of compliance piece. I think the origins of the modern sort of safety profession over the last 70 years post World War II were really around legal defence of organisations with workers. That was really the origins of it. As the world's evolved, we know that there's a lot of value in this sort of proactive risk management approach, this culture type approach. What are the things that there's a lot of movement and reform happening with the likes of IOSH and IIRSM and the sort of the professional bodies. What do you think the focus should be on for those sorts of organisations in terms of how they're developing safety professionals for this leadership piece that's needed to actually drive the change that's needed across industry?
That's a good question. It's quite a complex sort of world, right? So I'm not a great expert on IOSH, right? So I'm a chartered member of IOSH. I do think that the qualifications of the pathways to becoming a health and safety professional are very technical, and they stop at the technical world. It's incumbent on you to own your development in some of those other areas. Some people are naturals at that, right? That kind of explains why there aren't that many safety professionals, say, on boards or the C-suite, because they don't have that particular frame or mindset or skill set to be there. So I think the profession generally has focused very much on that compliance. Here's the technical bits, and you go and help the organisation as you do. I think seeing what's happening in the profession now, and we're getting, thankfully, to see more and more safety professionals at really senior levels in the boards and everything else. I think it's incumbent for IOSH and IRSM to prepare their people for that. I don't know how they get into that. I mean, I don't know from an Irish perspective. Obviously, we've all got the typical sort of the blueprint, we call it, which is essentially our CPD sort of program, and you can access a whole lot of different courses, and I think they are leaning more towards some of those softer skills, but there's never been anything really deliberate robust, to it. Nothing really robust, what I would call. And it's the same thing with NEBOSH and everything else. I understand that NEBOSH is an examination sort of board, and it deals with safety knowledge, but I think it's incumbent on us to start producing far more rounded professionals in all those other disciplines. I think it's something we don't do very well.
Perhaps one consideration on that may be, because we're not talking about safety content here, we're actually talking about business.
Correct.
Business capability, executive function. And maybe the good oil on this could be for some of the professional associations to start to build relationships with business schools, for example, where there are programs calibrated to really help safety professionals develop that executive function, so that they can translate all those technical capabilities into the boardroom, into the executive suite.
100%. I think that'd be a real positive step, right? To be able to sort of swap out and understand sort of business, and understand sort of how business works and what you need to get decisions from X, Y, and Z, and all that sort of stuff. I think is vital to be able to play and operate in that world. So yes, I do think that would be a good thing. I think back to sort of a lot of my own sort of development. It's purely just been the exposure where I've gone to the execs or to the boards there. I've never done any actual business training. So you kind of source that yourself. So I think it would be great to have a signpost or a career path,
pathway.
I think it's important. I think in terms of so I saw something on LinkedIn this morning about equality. Like equality is about sort of opening the door to people, and equity is about creating a path for people to walk through that open door. And I think something like that would be quite good. So how do we get more and more people through it? By creating those pathways.
I mean, I definitely don't think leaving people to their own devices to try and work it out is going to systematically solve the problem. There's a lot of organisations out there and a lot of workers, and there's over 300 million of them having accidents where they've got to take 4 days off work or more every year around the planet. And so there needs to be some sort of systemic change in terms of how we actually develop leadership in that safety suite.
I agree, and I think this is going to sound really odd, but I think it's also around sort of devolving safety to frontline leaders.
Yes.
So, I think there's just as we're talking here about safety professionals skilling up into business, I think it's the other stuff needs to happen. So again, I'm blown away by how many sort of frontline leaders have a really poor knowledge of safety, or just common sense in some respects. Right? You look at something, it's like, what are you doing with that? It's like, that's not going to work. And so I find that quite interesting as well, that entire juxtaposition. So I'd love to see more business leaders who have been more trained. I used to work for one organisation which employed hundreds of safety people, people, and I used to look at it and go, why? I mean, it's almost empire building to a degree. You don't need these many safety people. Just increase the competence and the ability of the leaders to manage health and safety as part and parcel of their work, and track it as part and parcel of their work, as opposed to building these incredible sort of safety empires with loads of safety people in them, with just tons and tons of safety work and safety processes that actually mean nothing. They're just on their own, and I found that quite amazing. And I remember sort of suggesting to my director at the time, saying, hey, have we ever thought about sort of reducing the number of safety professionals as a way of improving our safety sort of performance? And it was almost like heresy.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense, right? It's like, I'm not saying just remove them. There's got to be, it's a formula, right? You've got to balance it out. So if I'm going to take X away, I've got to balance it with something else. What would be the balance? Well, an improved training program. Well, what would that improved training program look like? I said, well, maybe we have like a health and safety leadership course. How long? 3 or 4 days. 3 or 4 days. So you get into those little arguments. Then you're like, well, so how are we going to sort of break this chain? Yeah. So I think that is quite an interesting one for me. It's just how leaders themselves can actually be a bit more capable to apply basics. Because let's face it, a lot of what we do isn't complicated stuff, right? No. And a lot of it is just understanding the world of work and the tasks that people do and what they have at their disposal to do it. And
the complexity of humans, particularly humans who often are in this case, in this context of this conversation, are in leadership roles in organisations. They're in the C-suite, they're on the board, they're the head of or director of or global head of safety. So there's a lot of egos, a lot of different needs and wants across that spectrum.
Yeah, correct. And I do wonder sometimes, I do, just like I was explaining around sort of the Auckland Council Board and the examples where I had the confidence to throw my report away and say, do you know what, if you've got questions that I ask, and then do it. So I do wonder whether some of those safety leaders at that sort of level feel that comfort in just having the paperwork around them. What else do they know about the business? Probably not. How curious have they been about getting out there and doing that? And I think it's incumbent on some of those senior sort of safety leaders to break those molds and start having those conversations. Every opportunity that I'm in front of a board, I see it as an opportunity to educate. Yeah. And I think that's really important. And if you're just there to present on a report and go, I made it through that report, no questions, that's my goal. Mate, if that's your goal, how boring is that? Rinse and repeat. That would break me. I mean.
And we've talked about a number of sort of soft skills in terms of how a safety leader can kind of broker an organisation and move into this sort of proactive kind of culture-based approach to safety. And some of those have been things like, giving a real face to the content, moving away from just the report and going through the slides to support the report, giving it face, making it real. We've talked about understanding your stakeholders, who they are, what are their needs, recognising they're all different. And if you apply the same approach to them all, you're probably not going to get them where you need to go. Are there any other sort of key sort of soft skills or leadership skills that you've reflected on through your career that you think can really help move the dial in terms of getting traction, getting that alignment that you talked about in terms of getting the things you need, kind of getting the stars to align in order for that progression to happen, to unlock the gains that you've experienced?
I think there's definitely the ability to influence is one thing, right? But I think the key one that supports that, and you can't really influence until you've got this is trust.
Yep.
Right. I think there's a place for, as a safety professional, one of the skill sets, and it is a skill that can be learned, is how to earn trust.
Yep.
And we earn. There's a trust equation. I can't remember it now, but credibility is one piece there, and you've got to understand how you can earn the trust of people. At the end of the day, people are people, right? And it's like anything. It's like, am I gonna follow this individual? Do I think he's mad in the box of frogs, or do I think that there's actually something in this, but I trust him, and I'm going to go down that route? And I think trust. So learning how to foster trust, I think, is really quite important. I think the way I've done that, certainly, and it just works for me, right? But certainly the way I do that is I try to get to know individuals. So I try to create rapport. I meet regularly with all of our senior leaders, all of our execs, and we probably spend about maybe 5 to 10 minutes about safety. The rest of it is just around sort of just chit chat and people and just getting to align on stuff. I think there's a lot of tricks as well. I hope everybody does. I'm sure everybody does this, but don't drop bad news in a major meeting that's going to highlight or embarrass a leader. So, always sort of get around them first. So look, there's some information that might come out here that might particularly put you in a bad light. But, this is what we're looking. So I think
supporting people.
Supporting people. So once they understand that you've kind of got their back, they've got the trust, then I think you move into a different sort of relationship. And then I think you can start really moving the dial on a few things. I think trust is a big one for me.
I think, absolutely. I think that's mission critical, right? I think if you can win the trust of executive team and board, then, if the trust is truly there, then they will listen to everything you've got to say, and they'll it'll have credence. And then things will happen as a result of that. And equally, if that trust equation is eroded, which happens sometimes, then obviously the reverse is true as well, and you'll turn up and never get where you want to go.
I mean, you see it in a lot of organisations, right, where they for whatever reason stuff gets eroded, confidence, trust. They reach for an external or an external audit or something along those lines, and then the external audit comes back and finds certain things, which you've probably been saying as well. Why have they been able to say that? Again, there's an expectation because they're external, they got a bridge. It almost goes back to the point I was making right at the beginning with Auckland Council and walking in there going, right, I'm from the UK, I know a lot about safety, blah, blah. Just, it's almost that confidence piece.
How you carry yourself, how your body language,
everything.
All those things.
And I think that's really important. So I think that's a really interesting piece there. But once you start losing that trust and then you start doing things like that, then you've really got to answer a difficult question, which is, where has that trust broken down? How can I win it back? I think there's an old proverb that says, trust arrives on foot but leaves on horseback. That's how quickly it can be lost, right? So I think it's an important sort of thing to keep in the back of the mind there.
One of the challenges is, businesses have so many things on their plate, whichever type of organisation, public or private or NFP, they've got strategies they're trying to achieve, they've got revenue they need to capture, they've got a whole bunch of enterprise risks they're trying to stay on top of, they've got people sort of stuff going on, and the challenge is obviously how, as a safety professional, how do you elevate the opportunity to improve safety and from a culture perspective and a proactive perspective? How do you get that high enough up the flag mast to get the attention of the decision makers in an organisation?
That's not always an easy thing to do, but I think as with most things, and you just said about all the things that they need to manage, it's about the relevance of it. So what relevant part does safety play in what we're trying to do? And I suppose it's about understanding how we position safety as a foundation. So, you can do almost anything. If you haven't got the foundation in place, you're not going to achieve it for long.
It's wobbly, right?
It is wobbly, right? You're not going to have a strong basis for continuous improvement. You're not going to have that. I think that's kind of where you try and make it resonate. But that on its own is quite hard to sort of get in there. So, certainly at the place I am at the moment, at the city, what we're really trying to do is trying to make safety part and parcel of our corporate plan. So we've got some really ambitious things that we want to deliver over the next 5 years. How does safety play a part into that? So we have a people strategy that sits alongside the corporate plan. And that really is our way in. So it's like, okay, so people strategy. Let's think about people risks. Well, safety is one of those risks. And then, people generally buy into that. But then you start making it relevant in terms of, for example, the amount of resources that would be wasted through days off or
Lost
injuries
time,
or lost time and all that sort of stuff. And all of a sudden you start thinking, actually, we can, focusing on this can help us sort of just bolster some of the other projects. It's wastage at the end of the day. It's efficiency. So I think that I think genuinely, certainly for me, has definitely got us a real seat at the table in terms of understanding how to make that relevant. Never once do we really speak about the compliance pieces. Don't get me wrong, sometimes you have to, right? If you're not complying with the law, that's like, hey, actually, if something goes wrong, we're going to take a massive hit financially here potentially, and I think that becomes relevant as well.
It's the butter on the bread, not the spread, right?
100%. Yeah, I love that. That's a good saying. So so I think that's a really important thing that I always try to do is just how do we make safety relevant. And again, as we talked already, around sort of different execs didn't need different things from safety, and you've just got to understand what they are. But from an organizational perspective, again, just operationalizing safety so it's part and parcel and recognizable. When they talk, one of the tricks I always do, and it's really, really hard because is work with comms. So comms teams are always, when they're writing on behalf like the chief exec or they're writing on behalf of senior leaders, they will never have safety in the forefront of it. But actually a lot of the stuff that they normally write, you can weave safety really well into the narrative, which makes it feel that safety is part and parcel of their consideration. Not saying it isn't, but it's just a clever way of getting it in. And I think understanding how you get time and how you get return and sort of, again, the trust piece from people seeing these things being spoken about, I think that actually gathers a lot of momentum.
So what we're really talking about then is actually tying the safety outcomes in an organisation back into the actual core strategy of the organisation, right at the very core. Because I see a lot of organisations, across the globe that we work with, and safety is considered usually either as a social impact issue or a regulatory risk on the old risk register, on the enterprise risk register. And I think there's a lot of value lost in safety as a result of that, because it's not popping up on the CRO's radar as an economic impact, because no one's actually connected in. Actually, here's the cost of the true cost of harm of that, or do we actually know how much we're spending on incident investigations as a result of all the sort of small trivial stuff that is triggering that?
Exactly. That true cost of harm picture is really interesting, and it's something that I'm starting to get into now. Building on some really good work that's out there at the moment. But if you just think about sort of all the work that has been expended that typically isn't captured as a result of an incident, you start thinking, wow, actually, that's quite sizable amounts of money, where you tend to sort of almost look at the first layer. But every incident has a team of lawyers behind it that all need paying, and you think about it in that sort of way. You think, whoa, actually that's quite interesting. And when you start quantifying that, and then you start sort of putting it alongside sort of proactive objectives, you think, well, actually, this is the benefit that we can get. And I think this is where safety has probably got a few lessons to learn. If you look at things like marketing, or they've got things like click rate, and they've got click through rate, and they've got all these metrics that mean stuff to the business. Whereas in safety we don't tend to, so it'd be quite good. Again, I remember when I was working for Amazon, we tried to do this really cool piece of work within the FCs around trying to change our safety metrics from the standard LTI type stuff to operational metrics that actually were aligned to a process that could actually then give rise to safety risk. So really proactive stuff. So we were basically trying to chime in the operational teams with safety. So when operations got excited of one of their metrics going in the red and then all deploy, we wanted safety to be excited about that, because there was a consequence to that. So it's things like stow buffer rates and stuff like that. But that would never be seen as a safety thing.
Yeah.
But it absolutely was. It was a really proactive safety thing, because it could give rise to an incident. Whereas typically what safety would be looking at is the presence of a hazard on the floor that's there and that's recognizable. It's like, well, this is stuff that could be happening. So let's deploy a proactive control before we find ourselves managing the actual hazard.
Yep.
So that's the kind of stuff that I think we can do more of,
Yep.
Particularly in the metric space for
Yeah,
sure.
tied into productivity.
Yeah.
And the things that matter most to most businesses, productivity is a big one.
Yeah.
Cost control is a big one. And I don't say that degrading the importance of looking after people at a social level and at a regulatory level. Those are a given on this podcast. But I think the challenge is how we're starting to appeal and make it relevant for people who don't have the technical knowledge, so that they can recognise that the thing they're trying to achieve in the business, whether they're the CEO or the chairman or a director or a head of commercial or whatever it might be, if we can make it relevant to them, then they'll engage, and then we can get change happening.
Yep.
And then the next challenge that we sort of get to is, we get the top table, potentially the top two tables, the board and the C-suite on board with a direction, and we get the visible leadership happening and the learning transfer, and we start to get that really healthy sort of momentum going, which is a really exciting time when you sort of crack a few of those and you get going. And then you get to this real challenge called middle management. And we had, we worked together on a few projects where things have sort of started to drive down into the business.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a death trap for a lot of great initiatives, isn't it?
And do you know what? I think it's the compressed middle, right? So I think they get the poor end of the stick always, right? So I think when you think about sort of all the initiatives that come from the top, and then all the managing of people and the issues that brings, you can understand why they're so heavily constrained. So again, it's around simplicity for them. I mean, everyone loves simplicity, but it's not simple when you get to that sort of middle layer. Yeah. And I have a lot of sympathy. Whilst it is one of our biggest problems, always trying to get things past the operational layer, that sort of sticky middle. It is always one of the issues that I find. If you sort of get them aligned, then truly you get a lot of payback, right? Yep. So I think that is definitely one of the biggest challenges that we have. If you think about boards, like, I've always sort of defended sort of boards in many cases from safety teams who are demotivated. Oh, they don't care, it's like, well, actually they do, and actually they're doing why. But it's when it starts rolling out into the directors or the senior managers that things start slowing down. And the way that they see it, or the safety team, when the safety team see it, is that, well, they should be held to account. But that's quite a negative sort of cycle to be constantly doing. So how can we go in and start being those change agents to break that? How can we start motivating that? I think for me, this is where I think the bit certainly in my professional practice that I've really sort of tried to really push with my teams is this whole sort of, it's a very military sort of term, but it's getting in the trenches with them. Yeah. So it's actually, I'm not here to bring you more process or more procedure. Like, you tell me, I know what to do about safety, but you tell me what you need to achieve and how you need to achieve it, and I'll try and design whatever stuff I do to be more effective for you. And if that means, and this is the thing, right? Because it gets us to work 10 times harder. If that means that for this business unit, I need to design my incident reporting form in a different way, then so be it. But of course, when you've got, I'm not going to beat up ISO, but when you've got the 45,001 systems who like these paper processes and everything else, it just makes the thing so much more complex. And whilst it is accommodating of like throwing in a new process procedure, you then got to reflect that procedure, you've got to reflect that process in a piece of paper, and if they don't add up, you don't get your ISO. So you think, actually, this is where things don't help us. But I'd much rather have 10 different business units who did 10 different things from a safety perspective because it fits them, and then leave it to me to sort it out. And this is where I think data is really important, right? I think we've got to have ways of being able to just gather all those inputs. So it's helpful for people to apply, but clearly we need to gather the data and the output. So, creating some sort of central repository for data that we then can crunch and do what we need to do. But actually at the front end, give them something that works for them, which is, I'm a great big fan of things like, like incident reporting systems that are super simple, like 3 questions, no more. Whereas, you see some incident reporting systems, it's like, you're asking a manager who's very, very busy, or you're asking a worker who might have a reading age of 10 to sort of fill in, like, categorize this accident, this incident into it's like, what? It's like
even like just write a story about, and if they're not that sharp at
so we
writing.
so we need to almost lean into different ways of gathering that information.
So really, it's really some of the same principles then as how we influence a board or a C-suite in terms of making it relevant for them at that middle management level as we sort of come down through the organisation. We know through some of our data set that management knowledge is a systemically low area globally. So we could have a great health and safety management system, great safety professional, great board, even potentially a great executive team. But then we know that things like risk management are pretty poorly understood at management level, like generic risk management. We know that health and safety kind of basics are poorly understood at that level. So it's how do we make it real? So let's use data to really make it relevant, so that they can see. Did you realise this is what's going on in your part of the business? These are the areas that present some risk. And this is the impact if we don't respond to these risks. This is what could happen. So build that, and then focus on building the capability so that you're in the trenches the way you described it. With them, so they don't feel it's sort of something that they've been asked to do that they just don't understand how to do it. They've actually got someone with them showing them how to do it, making it relevant, and helping them apply it.
Yeah, and being able to tell them, what's important, what's not important. You don't need to bother with that. You need to bother with it. It's about making it highly sort of effective for what needs to happen. It's just getting rid of the chaff. And I think in safety there's a lot of chaff, right? I think there's a lot of nice to haves and everything else. I think that's kind of really where I think the value is in safety. It's about generally, and I say this to my teams a lot, it's like you can't do your job from being in the corporate HQ in the corporate office. You need to get out on the ground. Even as a second line of defense function, right? You still need to understand the front line of the business in order to support them. You need to be able to get that push forward. So I think that's something that I really sort of, again, push out to safety professionals is like, get out and understand your business, understand the context of the business, understand the context of what they do, understand their pressures, understand their stresses, what are their real concerns, really get to know and understand your teams. And again, that whole trust thing is important. You'll gain that by being out there and caring. So I think it's really important that you're seen to be wanting to solve problems for them as opposed to just wanting to solve problems for you.
Yes, yeah.
Just like gathering data or whatever. So I think that's important.
So we've been talking about the importance of self-awareness and vulnerability as a safety leader. How do you balance out the tension point between bringing that vulnerability to the table, but perhaps in an environment where there's an assumption that harm won't occur?
Safety is not about getting everything 100% right. Safety is about how we fail safely. What do we learn when we fail? They're like, whoa, that's but the reality is you're not going to prevent every single accident. It's just impossible.
It's that whole conversation around risk tolerances. With boards, they just cannot have the conversation. In large organisations, they might have at least a fatality every year. And it's saying, what are we prepared to take on? What risk are we prepared to take on? Same as the financial other risk areas. And it's like, we're happy to take on this much harm.
I remember Todd Conklin saying something similar around sort of, can't remember the full story, but basically around sort of traffic collisions. And sort of saying, why don't people die in cars anymore? It's like, because they gave up on trying to make cars not to crash, and they actually allowed them to crash safely. So the airbags, the crumple zones. So you're still having the collision because that's just always going to happen.
People fall asleep.
But actually it will fail safely. And I think that for us, there's some really good learning there around the safety world, around learning how to fail safely. And that's something that is a difficult conversation, I think, with a lot of boards. It's like, what? So you're basically saying that you're not going to prevent accidents. It's like, well, we're going to try and mitigate accidents from happening, absolutely, but I don't think any safety professional can say that I will make sure this organisation never has any accidents or near misses ever again. I think you're lying.
What we're saying is that we can't say that the control is 100% effective because there's variability in the context of the risk. And
just in the nature of work and sort of the variables that you're introducing to everyday work. Like you think of weather, lighting, tools, equipment, person, mindset. Wow. I mean, I'd like to see the person who can write that risk assessment or design that safe system work. It's impossible. So I think it's an important narrative around understanding sort of how we how we sort of speak to our boards around failing safely and around learning. And I think this is for me where that learning mindset is really, really important. So like, and again, it goes back to the trust equation and everything else. Like if we get our people to really let us know when they failed, then actually we'll learn much more, as opposed to getting people who won't report those incidents or those near misses because they'll get blamed or somebody will lose their shit. And and I'm not going to put my head above the parapet again because last night I got shouted out, or he was off with me for like a couple of weeks after I told him. If we can eliminate that, then you're more likely to get the passive information coming up, and that gives you a plethora of data to be able to act upon, right? So I think that gives you much more data than an incident, for example, which got a low data
or a risk
yield.
assessment that a board member sitting there and goes, they've got this many risks. We've got a little green colour I catched them, and then these risks here have got a nice little amber.
This is all green.
These ones have got a nice little red. So that's cool. But we've got some controls for those, so that's all good. So great, the safety team are doing what they should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I still, with my current board, I still haven't had that conversation around failing safely. So I'm looking forward to that. But I think I've learned sort of how to weave that in over the years, right, of saying that and introducing that to boards. And sometimes you might have to dilute the message or whatever, but it kind of depends what those relationships are. But I think it's an important conversation to have.
Yeah, and we're not suggesting here to safety professionals just to sort of rock on into the CEO and just sort of open up and say, well, look, this is the way it goes. There needs to be a tactical consideration to how you navigate that. So if you're thinking about doing that, just take stock and have a pause.
Yeah, just pause and take a step back.
You want to get to that vulnerability and you want to get to that failing safely kind of concept, but recognizing where the maturity sort of sits in the organization as your starting point and where you need to get them to and how you're going to step them through that over a period of time to the end states, and then having the patience to take them on the journey. I think it's pretty key there.
It goes back to kind of what we've been saying through this whole sort of podcast, right? It's about trust, right? You can't go in day one, nobody knows from Adam. It's like, right, we're going to have accidents. All right, okay.
Can we get the next person going?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah.
All right, so we're starting to boil things down to the last little section of today's session. It's been great. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Some real cracking information that people they'll be able to take away from your experiences, which is awesome. Thanks, Ollie. So some quick fire questions, if you may. First one is, who is the most inspiring leader from a safety perspective you've encountered, and what learnings do you feel we could take from them?
Gosh, I think for me, someone who changed my thinking at a really early stage was John Green. In my career, and again, he did this really cool thing with comparing audit sites when he was at Langer Rourke, and that was really interesting. That got me thinking differently. Another safety hero I have is a guy called Ricky Ricola. I don't know if you know who he is, but Ricky Ricola was the guy who evacuated people from the towers, and the area that he was responsible for. He was the head of safety and security for I think it was Morgan Stanley. I could get that wrong, but he basically had a contingency plan. When they were asked to move into the towers, he could see the threat from terrorism even before it happened. And he said the only way that I'm agreeing to this move is if I'm able to build the contingency plans to the way I want them. He's an ex-military guy and everything else, and he did. And there's no coincidence that everybody who survived the disaster were from that business.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Really interesting story. Ricky Ricola. He was actually a Cornishman, but he then deployed into the States and went to Vietnam and all sorts of stuff. So incredible story. I really commend to read that story.
Look him up, eh? Look him up.
Yeah.
Awesome. Second one here. What's the most confronting but impactful suggestion for how businesses could improve safety culture?
Listen to your people more. Turn that pyramid around. Empower more. Allow people to have more freedom. Listen to them more. Push power to information, not information to power. 100%. There's an incredible book by Ricardo Semler. He talks about the change that he made in his business by doing that. It went from a very corporate top down to empowering his people as to when they could take holiday and all this like proper utopia stuff, but it worked. Yeah, really powerful stuff. Ricardo Semler.
Look that one up. Another banger.
Yeah.
What do you think the most critical ingredient is to fostering a positive, proactive culture of safety?
I would say trust.
Yeah.
I'd say trust, right? I think people need to understand why you're doing what you're doing. And I think if we take away sort of all the negative connotations in a work context of having an accident and the blame and the fear and the retribution, I think trust, yeah, definitely. You do that, and I think that'll be, I think you can get some marked improvements around how people engage and everything else. And once people engage, that's the beginning of the good stuff, right?
Yes.
Once people start engaging, it's that whole productivity drive and the whole buying in. And I just think if you can master that engagement, I think the gateway is trust.
Yeah.
Then I think you can pretty much achieve anything.
Trust is just.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, lucky last. What's the best piece of advice you would give a safety professional looking to stimulate and grow a culture of proactive safety in a business that perhaps they've moved into the head of role on, they're looking to embark on this journey?
Lessons learnt from mine, because I was I've always been quite accidental in terms of doing that, is be really deliberate with your development.
Yeah.
Get some help. Don't keep it all to yourself. We are so lucky these days to have things like LinkedIn and platforms. Just be out there. Just speak to people. I think everybody generally as a community wants to help and support people. So just get out there and ask a question. Find yourself a mentor. Find yourself somebody who can guide you in this sort of stuff. There's a lot of businesses out there who do development stuff in the soft skill piece.
Yep.
I remember the work that was done back in the UK about 8 or 9 years ago with frameworks.
Yep.
Really good stuff.
Yep.
I went through that program myself, and I credit that with a lot of the successes I've had in my career. But yeah, absolutely, just be curious and just be deliberate about where you want to go and what you want to do. I get frustrated when I speak to a lot of young safety professionals and their ambition is to just pass the diploma.
Yeah,
it's like, I get it, it's important. I was once like that. But what have you got beyond that? What do you want to achieve beyond that? Where do you want to go? I don't know whether that comes with maturity, right? Because I was nowhere like that at the age of 20 either. But
I think it's
a
bit of age and stage for sure.
Yeah.
But I think what sounds like what you're really saying is, there's a self-awareness piece, right? To be a really strong leader in any discipline, including safety, it's about internally in your internal monologue, truly recognizing actually what you don't know, rather than just focusing all your time and effort on what you think you do know. If you can have an honest reflection and have that awareness, and then to your point, seek out people who can help you fill your cup up on those things that you don't know.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Then you're going to be able to be more effective at trying to drive that change in a business and take on that culture journey.
It's always difficult to sort of look at yourself in the mirror and sort of try and identify your negatives. We're not wired like that in society, right? You're almost told to hide your imperfections or whatever, your weaknesses, and I just think that's so wrong. I think through my own upbringing and stuff, we were taught always, to be people pleasers and stuff, and I can see the damage that's done. I'm working really hard, my wife and I, with our children, to not pass that down. But honestly, it's so important to just be critical of yourself. And I keep saying to my kids, be coachable. Always be coachable. Feedback is so critical and important. Don't get vexed by it or emotionally sort of triggered by it. Treat it as a blessing. Thank people for giving you feedback. I think I ask feedback from my team quite regularly, and I think it kind of flummoxes a lot of people. It's like, well, but you're the director. Why are you asking me feedback? It's like, well, I'm not perfect, right? So I think it's really important to do that. So that's a skill and a practice that you've got to work at. It definitely doesn't come naturally.
And there's a generational roll through, right? That's there in terms of that shift from, own your strengths and just don't share your weaknesses type thing to the modern sort of world around actually vulnerability is an important leadership attribute. If you don't 100%. Have the vulnerability, you don't have a lot of self-awareness depth. If you don't have that, you can't get in a learning mindset. If you can't get a learning mindset, you can't grow.
100%. That vulnerability and that sort of ability to be your authentic self, and knowing that you're not the finished article. When will you be the finished article, right? So it's an element of constant learning, right? It's you're constantly sort of out there trying to absorb and learn and sort of you can learn stuff everywhere, right? In every part, in every discipline of business, not just in safety. I learn a lot from a lot of my business colleagues as well. I look at that and think, that's a really cool technique for doing that. So I think it's really important that you are open.
Because there's a loop back on that in terms of that, you mentioned trust as the most critical ingredient, and the trust equation itself, and self-awareness is such an important attribute there, because other, maybe perhaps in a lot of cases, safety professionals that are in leadership roles maybe aren't as cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of people around them who have got very strong leadership attributes already as well through their business development, whatever it has been, to get them at the board table or the C-suite. And so if they see a safety professional presenting that's not evidencing those vulnerabilities, the EQ, the understanding of their needs, then it's very hard to build trust.
Yeah.
So it goes sort of full circle.
It's that relatability as well, right? I think, if you are out there and you're perfect all the time, how can you relate to people like that? And I think ultimately that's an important sort of part in itself. And I think there's a very fine line between some leaders who are very cocksure and arrogant. I think that translates sometimes into a bit of toxicity or negativity sometimes. So I think having
be real.
Keeping it real is really, really important.
As Ali G said.
Sure. As Ali G says, isn't it? In the house.
Awesome. All right, Ollie, look, thanks very much for joining us today. It's been a really enjoyable conversation. You've got a heck of a lot of wisdom and war stories that you've shared with people out there, and I'm sure there's a lot of takeouts that people will be able to take out and just kind of give a bit of consideration to their own sort of career progression, maybe reflect on some of the challenges they may be having in their world to try and move organisations into the sort of culture-led approach, just proactive approach to safety. So our first podcast for the Art of Safety Leadership, Wisdom and War Stories, and it's been a real pleasure to have you. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Really good fun. Thank you.